My next guest is Ed Anthes-Washburn, and he's the director of the New Bedford Port Authority. Perhaps you have never heard of the New Bedford Port Authority. It used to be the Harbor Development Commission here in New Bedford, but now the HDC has been renamed. Ed, welcome.
Jim, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
The Harbor Development Commission in New Bedford goes back a long way, 1957 to be exact, and it really helped shape the waterfront as we know it. It served its purpose. Is that basically what we're talking about here?
I think the HDC over the years since 1957 when it was created has certainly evolved in terms of its scope. And I think, with the diversity of uses on the waterfront, obviously the number one fishing port in the country, but there's recreational boating. There's a lot of other, there's cargo coming in, clementines from North Africa, and the opportunity with offshore wind. I think the New Bedford Port Authority not only accurately describes what we handle on a day-to-day basis, but it also helps us sort of market the port to people outside of the region who don't necessarily know what HDC means, but would understand what the New Bedford Port Authority is. So that's really the goal there.
Now, the mayor said earlier this month, I thought it was a little humorous, the name Harbor Development Commission sounded small time. I never thought of it that way. I'm sorry. Is it really all about image?
Well, no.
It's
a good question. I think Harbor Development Commission. There's no place name to it, right? So that was one big issue that we tried to solve. Mm-hmm. But this the name change comes with a draft strategic plan that really charts the course for the next 5 years for the New Bedford Port Authority. So what we're going to be working on, what initiatives we're going to go after, and how we as an organization will gear up for those business development opportunities and those operational efficiencies. That's really what we're focused on as well. So really the content of that strategic plan is more important as an organization than whatever your name is. Although I do think that with this strategic planning initiative, it really does sort of change the idea of who the port is, who the New Bedford Port Authority is, and I think that having the name change sort of marks the beginning of something new and a new, more progressive and active moving forward organization.
So let's talk about that strategic plan.
Sure.
It outlines a few items, I think 5 or 6 items that you really want to get done over the next 5 years.
Yep.
There's kind of a 2023 timetable here. So what are some of those items you would like to achieve, and why are they important?
Yeah, so the first strategy, so really we developed this draft plan through our commissioners, the Port Authority commissioners, and the key. The thing that we're always trying to do is really provide superior services to our harbor users, and that may sound obvious. Obviously we should be doing that, but in terms of going into detail, in terms of maintaining our infrastructure, in terms of bringing in new infrastructure, in terms of just becoming a less reactive organization and a much more proactive in terms of new projects and maintenance. That's really what we're trying to do there. And that's also the second strategy, ensuring that harbor users have access to useful and well-managed infrastructure. So really we want to make sure our facilities, we control about 16,000 linear feet of bulkhead. And much of it was built between the middle and the early part of the last century. So there's a lot of infrastructure projects that we have, and there's a lot of maintenance that we have over the next 5 years that we really need to stay ahead of if we want to fulfill this grand vision and continue growing as a port.
So let's talk a little bit about, in terms of those kinds of things, those goals. What's the most important? Obviously, you want to maintain infrastructure, but
Yep.
You also want to bring in new business
Absolutely.
to the Port of New Bedford. I mean, expanding the port, doing special things down there. What are some of the more specifics, perhaps?
Yeah. So in terms of the actual infrastructure, about a year ago, we brought on for the first time a port engineer. His name's Jake Gonzalez, and his focus for the last year and a half. So we hired him in December of 2016, and his focus has really been condition surveys of all of our infrastructure. So we now have eyes, and we know where sort of that 16,000 linear feet of bulkhead sits. So right now, through a generous grant from the Seaport Council, we were able to rebuild Coal Pocket Pier, which is the home of much of the inshore fleet, the small lobster boats, the small draggers, that kind of thing. So we're in the process of rebuilding that, and we're also putting cathodic protection. So this is not the really fancy and exciting necessarily stuff, but cathodic protection ensures that your steel bulkheads last decades longer than if they weren't protected.
I mean, it's very important.
Yeah,
for the number one seaport.
Yeah, absolutely.
North
It's the nuts and bolts of making sure that we're not just going after the really flashy thing. We really need to make sure that our facilities are going to be here to last, much longer than even our strategic plan will, because it's very expensive long term to rebuild that infrastructure. Whereas if you can maintain it and make the useful life last a lot longer, you're going to be saving a lot of money, and you can put that savings over the long term into some of the business development initiatives that you just mentioned.
Now, there are a lot of little-known facts, really, about the Port of New Bedford. And one of the little-known facts, although it's been publicized, is the fact that the economic output from the port is 2% of the Massachusetts economy. It's not some small, minute number.
No.
2% of the Massachusetts economy happens right here on our waterfront with a lot of different activities from, as you've mentioned, fishing is the most prominent, but there's also, the pleasure boat business. There's also offshore wind, the prospects of offshore wind, and some other things too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's quite a diverse mix, as you've spelled out earlier, but it is a big part of the state's economy, and I think the Commonwealth is recognizing that.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, and that's one of the strategies is really to market and promote the port. So telling that story in an effective way is a big part of what we need to do over the next 5 years. But yeah, you're exactly right. In 2016, we did a study that looked at the economic impact of the port. Martin Associates out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, did the study. And we actually gave them a list of all of our waterfront businesses, and they called them all. There was over 150 phone interviews and sit-down interviews with folks on both the New Bedford and the Fairhaven side. We're definitely one port unit, and this our friends over in Fairhaven are a big part of the economic output of the Port of New Bedford, and really it was. I think the numbers really were the most shocking. So $9.8 billion, which is the 2% that you mentioned, but there's also 6,200 direct jobs that the port is directly involved in the port. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were very surprised, and the percentages that come from the seafood industry, both harvesting and processing, are, it tells a story of, obviously the harvesting that happens, and that's sort of who we identify as culturally, is the scallopers and the draggers, but that's only about a third of the tonnage that's processed in New Bedford. That 120 million pounds that we're the number one fishing port by value every year for the last 17 years, but that landed value is only about a third of what is processed, and a lot of that's brought in by trucks from overseas. So logistically, we're in the center of a really long supply chain that wraps around the world, and we saw that last week with the seafood buyers here. We saw that earlier this week with a group of Norwegians that were here. So folks internationally really know that story, sometimes in some cases better than
I think so.
than we do locally. And that's really what we're trying to change with that strategy number 5, is to tell that story in a more effective way, and get that info out there.
I really think people who live here sometimes take the port for granted. They don't understand it. They just see buildings and they don't really know what it's all about. But the fact is, it is a thriving place. Now, look, it'd be great if the draggers were harvesting more fish.
Yeah.
That's unfortunately not in the cards right now. And we've had some issues on the port with, Carlos Rafael and what he's been convicted of. But clearly, there's still a thriving business there.
Yeah, there really is. And, to your point about telling that story locally, so we're always trying to push our seafood processors and our harvesters to get their product internationally. But telling that story locally is a big initiative from the branding exercise that we went through last July. The New Bedford seafood brand, the Port of New Bedford seafood brand, is going to try to tell that story, connect to the local food movement that's so big in southeastern Massachusetts and in the United States in general, so that folks are asking for that New Bedford scallop on the menu, not just in the Far East or in Northern Europe, but in Fairhaven or in downtown New Bedford, making sure that seafood that is from New Bedford, and so that the locally branded portion of the seafood branding exercise is really focused on that, telling that story and telling that economic development story, that that 9.8 billion, telling that story as well. And it's all connected.
You're listening to Townsquare Sunday. My guest is Ed Anthes-Washburn, who's the director of the New Bedford Port Authority, formerly the Harbor Development Commission. How could this name attract new business here? Obviously, that's part of your mission as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the key part is, so the Port of New Bedford is more than just my organization. There's dozens of private businesses, private seafood businesses that are part of the Port of New Bedford. There's 2 state facilities, the State Pier and the Marine Commerce Terminal, on our waterfront. That's part of the Port of New Bedford, and having a comprehensive way of marketing the port really is our job. And doing that as the Harbor Development Commission doesn't have quite as much bite as the New Bedford Port Authority, whereas having the name, having the proper noun as part of the name is going to be important in marketing the port in that way.
What can we look for in the next couple of years, perhaps, that are eminent things, really things that you guys are focused on now to get done?
Yeah, so I think
infrastructure ones, that's ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. Infrastructure is a big one. I think a big initiative that I am really excited about is trying to figure out what other opportunities there are with the natural resources that we have coming in, with the fish that are coming in. So earlier in the fall of 2017, we signed we created the New Bedford Ocean Cluster, which is the Port of New Bedford working with IoT Impact Labs in downtown New Bedford. And the opportunity there is, how do you put sensors onto fishing vessels and, as they go and harvest fish, is there an opportunity to harvest data, and what does that mean for fishing vessel revenue in the long term? The Ocean Cluster also joined the Ocean Cluster Network, which includes Botsfjord, Norway. We had a group from Botsfjord, Norway here on Monday, and Reykjavik, Iceland, and the Norwegians and the Icelandic, the Nordic countries are much further advanced in terms of using the full fish. So here in New Bedford, for the most part, the fillets go for human consumption, and the rest of it goes to bait or cat food or some other animal feed. Whereas in the Nordic countries, especially Iceland, they're really at the cutting edge of turning that what we sometimes consider a byproduct or a waste product, turning that into beauty products, using fish skin as a bandage because it has healing properties, using the collagen in the fish for beauty products. So really looking at the fisheries as a natural resource and figuring out what are the next steps to derive value from that natural resource. So that's one of the things that we're really focused on is getting more value out of what we currently land in New Bedford.
You ever see the day when we'll have a fish beauty products factory here in New Bedford?
Yeah, that's what we're focused on. Right. It's a big part of what happens in the rest of the world, and why not us?
Does it concern you when people talk about commercial development on the waterfront? I'm talking about more restaurants and touristy kinds of places, let's call it.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the New Bedford Port Authority actually gets a big chunk of its revenue from recreational boating. So we operate Pope's Island Marina. It's a big part of what we do. We also operate all the moorings. And one of the key selling points for New Bedford is our working waterfront. People want to see that, and we've done a pretty good job at marketing that to the recreational boater. Now, there's always ways that you can do that more effectively, and there's a lot of ways that you can bring folks into the central waterfront in a safe way to learn about the fishing industry, and it's a big part of what we're trying to do with all the planning that we have going on, with the redevelopment planning of the Eversource Sprague site, also Hicks Logan Sawyer up on the north terminal. So, yeah, I mean, it's a balance. You want to continue to tell your story because that's going to be important in terms of policy. It's important in terms of moving the needle in terms of fisheries regulations. People need to know the fisheries story, and it's a whole lot easier to tell that story if you have actual people interacting quite a bit. So I do think that there are opportunities on a small scale in the central waterfront to make it a little bit more, a little bit better for the public to enjoy the central waterfront. And one of the key things that's coming out of the redevelopment plan is showing the public through a fish offloading facility where they can learn about have you ever been to Chatham? Have you seen the Chatham Fish Pier?
No, I haven't.
So that's actually the number one tourist attraction in Chatham is the fish pier. People like seeing fish being offloaded in this beautiful setting. That's what we want to provide as well. And it's completely consistent with our working waterfront, but it does it in a way that is a great, that is a tourist attraction and gives people an opportunity to learn about the fishing industry.
Ed Anthes-Washburn, Director of the New Bedford Port Authority. Ed, thanks for coming in.
Jim, always a pleasure. It's always a fun time.
And good luck with the name change and also the continued development of the port.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, take care of yourself.